The Authors Guild Foundation is the educational and philanthropic branch of the Authors Guild,
America's oldest and largest professional organization for writers.
The Authors Guild Foundation educates, supports, and protects American writers
to ensure that a rich, diverse body of literature can flourish.
We do this by advocating for authors' rights,
educating authors across the country in the business of writing,
and promoting an understanding of the value of writers.
The foundation advocates on issues of copyright,
a right enshrined in Article 1 of the Constitution, guaranteeing authors the right to own and profit from their work.
We fight piracy and the theft of creative work.
We promote literacy and increased access to books in disadvantaged communities.
We advocate for increased funding and outreach for public libraries.
The Foundation believes that an abundance of free literary expression is essential to our democracy.
And that can only be achieved by protecting authors' constitutional and moral rights to benefit from their work.
The Authors Guild Foundation works on behalf of all writers, emerging, mid-career, and established writers in all genres.
Novelists and essayists.
Children and YA books.
Poets and translators.
Journalists and nonfiction authors.
Thriller and mystery writers.
You get the picture.
Through our many educational programs, the Authors Guild Foundation teaches writers the business of writing
and equips them with the knowledge and tools they need to succeed.
We foster and celebrate diverse voices in American literature
and promote the ability of writers to earn a livelihood so they can keep writing.
The foundation works to defend the author's right to free expression
and prevent erosion of the exchange of knowledge and ideas.
We advocate for strong, effective intellectual property laws,
as well as fair treatment of authors, so that writing remains a viable profession.
So if you love books, writing, literary culture, the written word, moving poetry, excellence in journalism, the perfect thriller,
please make a donation.
All of us at the Authors Guild Foundation thank you so much for your support.
Thank you 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 for your support.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Hunter Renette, and I am on the Authors Guild Foundation board. What a perfect long weekend we've had. Thank you for supporting and engaging in this inaugural week of WIT, but I don't want 1 minute to go by without truly thanking the executive director, Lynn Bolger, without whom this entire stimulating festival, please, would not have happened. Lynn, thank you. I also want to remind you that tomorrow at 11 o'clock, there will be a short play performed here, comedic, written by Laura Peterson, called Community Service. And it stars David Rockefeller and Pamela Ewan, and it's at 11 o'clock right here. Laura is one of the wittiest writers and funniest people I know, so I'm sure it's going to be a good time. Now, I'd like to introduce our final 3 authors for the exploration of our final topic, identity and belonging, within this reimagination of American theme. There certainly seems to be an urgent need right now to capture and explore our identity as a country and in our communities and as individuals relating in our world. First up, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator in the stage right chair, Marie Arana. Marie was born in Lima, Peru, the daughter of a Peruvian father and an American mother. She moved to the United States as a child, and this bicultural life has richly informed her fiction and nonfiction works, presenting a depth and a knowledge of this final topic of identity and belonging. Her memoir, American Chica, was a finalist for the 2001 National Book Award, and her biography of Simón Bolívar won the 2014 Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Recently, She wrote a vast history of Latin America titled Silver, Sword, and Stoned, and was named Best Nonfiction Book of 2019 by the American Library Association and shortlisted for the 2020 Andrew Carnegie Medal of Excellence. Marie has served and serves on many, many boards and currently serves on the board of PEN America and indeed our Authors Guild. Please welcome Marie. Now I'd like to introduce Akhtar. I was first introduced to this astounding playwright and novelist with his deeply compelling Pulitzer Prize-winning play, Disgraced, at Lincoln Center. It is a piece of theater not to be missed. Disgraced reaffirms all the stimulating conflicts that religion, politics, and indeed self-identity create, making it a recipe for really great theater. In addition, his plays The Invisible Hand, The Who and the What, and Junk all won richly deserved multiple awards and honors. His first novel, American Dervish, set in suburban Milwaukee, follows a Pakistani-American boy's struggle in weighing the traditions of his ancestral homeland and a new world that is both threatening and exciting in a pre-9/11 America. His second novel, Homeland Elegies, explores the crisis of identity in a post-9/11 America. Through narrative, memoir, essay, his brilliance is at work, sharing with us such multidimensional characters. He serves on the board of Yaddo, he's a trustee of the New York Theater Workshop, and is currently the president of PAN America. Last year, he was named the New York State Author by the New York State Writers Institute, receiving the Edith Wharton Citation of Merit of Fiction. Please welcome Ayad. And finally, we have Susan Choi, the extraordinary author whose fifth novel, Trust Exercise, was the winner of the 2019 National Book Award for fiction. All of Susan's novels have been critical successes, but it feels like this novel is a runaway sensation, sparking an international conversation that we are delighted to be taking part in, and one which encompasses the nature of storytelling itself. Witty, satirical, she really seems to understand the complexity of people in all of her work. Joan Didion praised Susan as a natural, a writer whose intelligence and historical awareness effortlessly serve a breathtaking narrative ability. In 2021, Susan received the Sunday Times Audible Short Story Award for the emotionally gripping Flashlight. Please, please take time to listen to this Audible. It is touching piece. You probably have read all of her good work in The New Yorker, and she serves as a trustee of PEN America, currently teaching writing seminars at Johns Hopkins University and is a faculty member of the Breadloaf School of English at Middlebury College. Please welcome. Now I turn it over to you, Marie.
So much, Hunter. What a pleasure. First of all, I want to do a shout out again to Lynn and her staff, and Hunter and Vinny and Nikki and Rich and all of the people who have worked to make this festival so successful. And you get to see the finale, which is really wonderful. So congratulations to you for being here. It's a pleasure to see you all. How many of you in the audience are immigrants? Okay. How many of you in the audience are children of immigrants? Oh, in the audience. Okay, good. Because that's what identity and belonging is about, right? I mean, it can start with our, everyone goes through the identity and belonging circus of junior high school, I suppose. But immigration is really about identity and belonging. We all have our own immigration stories. As for myself, as Hunter said, I am the daughter of a Peruvian father and an American mother. My mother was an immigrant to Peru, so that's how it started. Our story started. She was an immigrant to Peru for about 15 years, and then she said, "That's it, I'm out." And then my father became an immigrant to the United States, and he's stuck. So that is our story. Ayad's story is son of two immigrants, but he's born in the United States, totally American, and in every way, except with this obsession that we all have about identity and belonging, right, and immigration. And Susan is the daughter of a Korean who came to the United States to college, to the University of Sewanee, was it?
The University of the
South.
South.
That's the South.
Yeah.
And her mother was a second-generation immigrant from Eastern Europe, right? Your grandparents were from Eastern Europe.
I can never remember what number it is, but she was the daughter of immigrants.
Right. So different stories, different immigrant stories, different parts of the world, but we come from the three top immigration sources in the world. Right now, the top immigration source is not Latin America, which you might think. It's actually Asia. Asia has overtaken Latin America in its immigration numbers. So Susan represents the Asian immigration, the largest force right now. I represent the Latinos, who are the second largest, and Ayad represents the third largest, which is the South Asian population, which is, I don't think we would have doctors in this country without South Asians and Asians. So, and I think you actually say that in your
late
book.
in the book.
I think late in the book. So we do have that in common. We also have in common that each of us has written a book with American in the title, right? American Chica, American Dervish, American Woman. So there's that. And we also have I think, Susan, began in a performing arts school. So there's a little theater in your blood. There's a lot of theater in this man's blood. And I actually started in performing arts too. So there's a bit of the theatrics about us as well. So that's probably why we're here talking about identity and belonging. But what I want to do is start by asking you if you would tell us a little bit about the subject and the idea behind each of your books. Fantastic books if you haven't read them. Susan's is Trust Exercise, her number 5 book, I believe. And Ayad's second novel, which is just extraordinary, Homeland Elegies. So I'm going to ask you both to say just a few words about what your books are about, and then maybe read a snippet from each. So, Susan, want to start?
Yeah, thank you. Trust Exercise is a novel that at the outset is about a group of young theater students in a performing and I think it's just a performing arts high school. They are teenagers. They dream of being famous actors. They are under the sway of a charismatic theater instructor, and they're at the beginning of their sexual lives, and they're trying to piece together their adult identities as artists. And the title, Trust Exercise, actually was a working title for me. When I first started drafting the material that became this book, I did not intend for it to be a novel. I was trying to write a short story. I called it Trust Exercise just as a placeholder, but what I was thinking about were the trust exercises that I had been taught as an acting student in my teenage years when I briefly went to a theater program as well, and trust exercises that are intended to, as I understood it, and this may not be actually what they were supposed to be doing, but they're intended to break down resistances to emotional experiences. They're intended to kind of open up the person to the range of emotional experience that they might need to tap in order to be an effective performer. My experience of trust exercises as a young person was just of a series of deeply bizarre, often frighteningly invasive and humiliating activities, and I later was fascinated to discover when I was reading the amazing journalistic work of Lawrence Wright, who's written about the Church of Scientology. I was amazed to discover that the Church of Scientology has actually codified a lot of processes for solidifying its structure and for taking in new members that borrowed almost directly from the trust exercises that I had been taught as an acting student. So the book examines that process of becoming. And I'll just read, I'm going to read from the middle just to be utterly confusing. The book begins with the story of this group of teenagers who are friends and lovers. They're very, very young. And then midway through the book, there's sort of a bit of a revolution in the middle of the book. It gets kind of thrown over by one of the characters who invades and says, everything that you've read is untrue. And her name is Karen, and she has a beef with the preceding 131 pages, and she comes into kind of, and I'm sorry, I have spoiled a certain aspect of the book for you, but I think it'll still be fun. So I'll read very briefly. This middle section is called Trust Exercise, as is the first section, as is the last section, as is the book itself. Karen stood outside the Skylight bookstore in Los Angeles, waiting for her old friend, the author. Her old high school classmate, the author. Was it assuming too much to say, friend? Was it accepting too much to say, Karen? Karen is not Karen's name, but Karen knew when she read the name Karen that it was she who was meant. Does it matter to anyone apart from Karen what Karen's real name is? Not only does it not matter to anyone else, but the fact that it matters to Karen will probably reflect badly on Karen, in the same way that so much about Karen reflects badly on Karen. So Karen won't insist on providing her real name or anyone else's, although she'd like to say, for the record, that she can see right through the choice of Karen for her designation. With apologies to actual Karens, Karen is an unsexy name. It's too recent to have retro chic and not recent enough to feel fresh. It's a name without snap. It gives you a plain feeling, but not plain enough like Jane, which is such a plain name that phrase, plain Jane, in contradiction of its meaning, has snap. It rhymes and suggests a romantic plainness. The phrase plain Jane makes people smile. Karen has no such associations. That's wonderful. Thank you. Wonderful book. Just absolutely wonderful. Ed, please tell us about yours.
My dad was drinking himself into a daily stupor. He was 5 vodkas in before 11 a.m. My mom had died. Trump had just been elected. I had been through a bunch of personal stuff apart from sort of drama around my father and my mom's passing, which was very dramatic as well. And it was just something about the moment that summoned, I don't know, some kind of a voice out of me. And I started writing this book, not really knowing what it was about. I just knew that the country that my parents had come to, they both came in the late 60s, 68, 69, and they both died 50 years later, right about. And they'd been here for a half century. The country they had come to was a very different country than the country that they were now dying in. And I had been here about 50 years too, and it just seemed to me that the story of what had become of their lives here and what had become of the lives of their children and their friends and their children told a really good story about what had happened to America and how we ended up in a situation that a lot of people didn't quite understand how we could have gotten here. To some of us who had not been here and then were here, it was maybe not as much of a surprise. The narrator has many of the facts of my life, and he has my name, so lots of people think it's about me. Might have wanted to think that through a little bit, but it is a novel. I'm going to read from a section where the narrator, again with my name and who wants to be a writer, is in college. He's told his parents he wants to be a writer, and they told his aunt, the mother's cousin, who is the only person in the family who knows anything about writing. She teaches literature at University of Connecticut. So she's in town one evening, and she invites the narrator to dinner, to talk to him. She's brought a couple of books with her for him. One of them is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I'm sure somebody has made you read the Jane Austen already. I do think it's the most wonderful novel ever written. I don't think you can read it enough times, and not just for the pure unending delight. Her analysis of the world is not to be underestimated. You will find more wisdom about the way the world really works in those pages than a million more pretending to tell you. Money, 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 that's all it ever comes down to. What are you reading currently? She asked as she bit on a piece of bread and started to chew. Rushdie, Midnight's Children. Brilliant book, just brilliant. No, the Satanic Verses. She coughed. She reached for her water and sipped to clear her throat, staring at me, the taut lines on her forehead now crossed and furrowed. Why are you reading that? The Rushdie was the final reading assignment in my ongoing independent study with Mary Maroney, the professor I mentioned earlier, and of whom there will be more to be said in the pages ahead. I'd been curious about Rushdie's book since its publication 5 years prior. My mother bought a copy during the commotion, tried reading it, and soon gave up. More than a year later, the book had lain on her side table in the living room where she'd set it down, never to pick it up again. It took me 3 days to read Rushdie's book, 3 days that remained singular in my reading life. I'd never encountered so much of myself on the page before, my questions, my preoccupations, the smells and sounds and tastes of names of my family, a potent form of self-recognition that bred a new certainty. I existed. Most thrilling was the book's unapologetic parody of the Muslim mythology I'd grown up with as a child. To write a book filled with so many unthinkable thoughts and to do so with such joyous abandon, I didn't know anyone could do such a thing. But as I sat across from my aunt that evening in downtown Providence, I wouldn't have time to find the words to explain how significant an event Rushdie's book was in my life. She interrupted my hesitating silence and began her attack. I never thought I would be saying this about him after that brilliant first novel. I mean, brilliant. Look, I know he never came up with anything on his own, borrowing everything. And of course, what crime is there in that? Everybody knows there's not a new idea to be found anywhere under the sun. Shakespeare stole from everyone. So what's the issue with Salman doing the same thing? The problem, beta, is that you have to do it well. You have to do it better than the ones you're stealing from. He's not anymore. It's used, tired, worst of all, but this is what really bothers me, it's the malice. Malice? The sickening ad hominem attacks on the Prophet, peace be upon him, picking through that disgusting Orientalist history, disgusting tales the Christians told to make the Prophet out as some sex-crazed cult leader. God forbid. I mean, this is what we have to expect from Salman, from one of us. He says he's not a Muslim, Auntie. She snorted. Please, I read that idiotic essay. Even more pathetic than how derivative he's become is his cowardice. He knew what he was doing when he was writing that book. I know for a fact we have friends in common. He was going around talking about sending the mullahs a message. They won't forget. Well, message received. But guess what? He didn't like how they received it. So now it's not about Islam, he says. I'm not Muslim. How can it be blasphemy if I don't believe in it? He's a coward. He's a coward and a hypocrite.
Wow.
I can get carried away.
So you get a bit of the dramatic aid as well. So it is fantastic performance, my goodness. Doubly fantastic for the literature. It's just as good as the performance. Aid, thank you. Thank you. So I want to do something that Susan does. In fact, Karen in your book does. Because I'm a linguistic nut. I'm a graduate school linguist. I taught it for a while. And I love the fact that she analyzes the etymology of words, because then she's drilling down into language in the way that I at least adored. And so let's take identity. Identity comes from the Latin idem, right? And it's identitas, and it means basically being the same, which is interesting, right? You're supposed to be the same as something, the same as yourself, presumably, which is interesting in itself. Belonging, on the other hand, comes from a Dutch background. I think it's Belangjan, or Belangjan. I don't speak Dutch, so I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, but It actually is related to the Old English long, which is interesting in itself. Belonging means that you actually ascribe yourself to something else, some other. So it's not yourself, it is actually recruiting yourself to another identity. So that's the trajectory that an immigrant takes, right? It's taking not only the formation of yourself, which these kids are doing in your book, but it's then becoming something else and trying to reinvent yourself as somebody else. So let's start with that, sort of definition of what we're trying to get at here. And that makes me want to ask you about truth, because if you're wanting to be the same as something, you have to know what you want to be the same as. What is that self? What is that truth of yourself? And both of your books, I think, deal with the issue of truth. And I think they were both written in a time when truth was very wobbly, right? They were written at a time, you both, I think, were reaction to the Trump years. I want you to talk about that. And I want you to talk about that relationship or that anger about truth that comes certainly from your book, Susan. From Aid, what I see about the truth is that you are taking the truth of, they've called it what? Auto-fiction, right? You're taking the truth from your own experience, from your own life, from your father's experience, from the people around you, and you are creating a fiction out of it, which is playing with the truth in a way.
Trump was the spiritual muse for my book.
Right, and so it's to my mind the reverberations of fake news. Who are we, and that notion of what is America, and where are we actually as people who believe in something that we don't quite seem to know what it is anymore. So I'd like you to talk about truth and how you relate to that, and how these wobbly truths, because both of your books are about wobbly truth. Could you comment on that?
Well, yes. I mean, I can start by saying that even though I think the traces of Trump might be less outwardly evident on Trust Exercise, which is a book set initially, at least in the early 1980s, in a drama school. Trump too was my muse. We owe him so much as writers and artists. And the section that I read just now, which, as I'd said, comes midway through the book, was no part of my plan for this book. As I also said, I was planning to write a short story about a bunch of teenagers in drama school. It was actually supposed to be a very simple story about, so as I always tell my fiction writing students, story needs incident and fiction needs conflict. And so you need conflict, you need incident, keep it simple. And I was trying to follow my own advice and write a very simple short story about a pair of teenage lovers, neither of whom has a driver's license, and they live in a city without public transportation. So they cannot get together to get it on. And that was the very simple conflict in my story. And I'd written 70 or 80 pages of this material about these young lovers unable to drive to their rendezvous, and I lost interest in my story completely. I put it down, I picked up other things. The world, meanwhile, under my feet was changing very rapidly. And in around 2016, that fateful year for so many different aspects of our lives, I really started thinking a lot about truth and storytelling. And the reason I was thinking about it was because, storytelling is not just what we do, but storytelling is the practice of history is a form of storytelling. Journalism is storytelling. Our identities are a version of storytelling. All of our collectively held national values. These are all stories. And that's not to say that they're false. Story is very, very important to the way we live and the way we conceive of ourselves. And at the same time, it's very powerful, and it can be distorted and weaponized. And I had noticed that our muse, as we're calling him, was a master storyteller. I had not expected this of him, but I had become increasingly alarmed by his mastery of storytelling, to the extent that he was somehow reframing certain stories that I had understood differently from childhood. And the main one was the story of immigration, which I had grown up believing unproblematically was a positive story about our nation. That our nation was a nation of immigrants, that we were stronger for our immigrants, that our nation was certainly the place where my father came to find safety, find prosperity, where he'd found a way to make a life for me. And suddenly this story was being told in very different terms, which I don't think I need to rehearse. I was marveling over how our muse had managed to do this. How had he managed to take the story of immigration and completely turn it upside down and make immigration into a horror story, into a scary story in which immigrants are villains and toxins? And as I was thinking about that, I started, for whatever reason, thinking about my kind of, at that point, inert story about the teenagers, and how in every story, there's always someone who may feel that the story involves them but isn't being told in their way. That's how I felt when the immigration story was being told in this new and toxic way. I felt that my story that was very important to me had been stolen from me and was being told wrong. And I was so angry, and I started to imagine, just to make myself feel better, I wonder if any of my characters feel the same way, if any of them feel like my story's being told wrong. And that's where Karen came from, my character. She kind of sprang full-formed and super pissed off into my mind and hijacked the story to really express my feeling about what I felt was my core story as an American being hijacked.
Which is really a very true point. I'm thinking of my own experience writing a memoir. It was my first book, American Chica. And my brother and my sister then threatened to write their own stories because they felt that they had been distorted too much. So, and then I dreaded that because their stories would have been very, very different, and their truths would have been very different.
Then you would have had to write another
and
story
I would have had to write,
about...
Yeah, I would have gone on and a war of memoirs. But thank you for that. Ed?
Yeah,
What's your truth?
I don't know. Views? Yeah. I was, as I laid out the sort of dramatic circumstance of my life and the sort of nation's moment and how that affected me emotionally and all of that. But I think there was another part of it, another part of this particular strategy that ended up becoming the strategy of the book, which wasn't really, as I said, foreordained or planned. I just started writing, and then this voice was coursing through me, and I was changing things as I went. And so, and I started to understand what I was changing things because I wanted to reach the reader where they were today. And where the reader was today, the reader didn't care about truth. The reader cared about being told a really salacious story, and to keep the reader really interested on every page, in every paragraph. So how could I write a very, very developed literary book about some really big questions and keep the reader engaged in this kind of primal animalistic way? Well, you know, Trump and hookers and syphilis, and it was all part of the strategy of that. The other thing that sort of was fascinating to me or frustrating to me or confusing to me as a storyteller was that we seem to have entered this time where fiction was being read as if it was nonfiction. So if you wrote a book and you were not an Eskimo, but you wrote a book about Eskimos, then nobody believed your book, even though it's a novel. And that was just something that had happened to the culture at large. You know, you get on Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and the first thing she asks you, you've written a novel, she's asking you all about your personal life. It's as if there was some need to sort of bolster or justify the act of taking someone's attention, and to say that there is truth in what I'm, but that truth is not a poetic truth, because we don't care about that anymore. What we care about is the truth of this fiction. And so I thought, okay, great. So I will be the guy. Then everyone assumes that if I gave it a different name, they would assume it was me anyway. So I'll just give them my name. So everyone will I will support their assumption that it's me. And then we can go somewhere really crazy. That's going to be fun. So in a way, I mean, I think I've gotten into some trouble with some people when I've talked about it this way, because I'm not trying to make the problem go away. I feel like as an artist, I'd like to reflect the problem and maybe even take advantage of it and use it to my advantage. So I have a problematic relationship with truth.
And this is a good segue into what I want to go into next, which is, of course, the immigrant experience, which is dealing with truth all the time. But in your novel, Homeland Elegies, the father, who is a doctor and is Trump's doctor, actually is brought in on a sort of a panicked cardiological event, and he loves Trump. And so there's that. And he loves America. Whereas the figure that goes by the name Aed is not so sure about America.
Well, he's caught between his parents. His mom hates America.
Right.
So
his mom hates America.
He never made up his mind.
Right. So what I want to get into now that we've been talking about truth, and let's talk about our truths as sons of, daughters of, or immigrants, or as I am myself. How Pakistani do you feel? You were born in, where were you born? In Milwaukee?
I'm Staten Island, but I grew up in Milwaukee.
No, grew up in Milwaukee. Totally American in so many ways, with very Pakistani parents, obviously very, your mother, very hesitant about the whole American experience. So how?
She liked Elvis.
Yes.
So the question is, how Pakistani do I feel?
How Pakistani are you?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a really good question. I never been able to make any sense of, and I therefore wrote a book about it. And I don't think I'm any the wiser. I think I'm an outsider, and I think that that's a pretty good place to be as a writer. I feel like I'm an observer, and I think I had a kind of pivotal experience growing up. A lot of the stuff I saw going on in my house was very different than the stuff going on in my best friends' houses, and so I kind of understood that what they thought was real in their houses was not real, and so what we thought was real in our house was probably not real either. And so there was a kind of contingency and an in-betweenness that was very much a part of my consciousness as a kid, and that I think made me see other people's points of view much more readily than, because it was all just what they thought. And so I think as far as the Pakistan of it all goes, I think I wish I felt more Pakistani. I know Pakistanis don't like me. And so, it's, I think that there's a feeling that I'm, airing dirty laundry and that I'm not even Pakistani and doing that. And so it's a complicated, it's a complicated thing. So yeah, I think, not sure.
Yeah. Very good answer. Thank you so much. Thank Susan, how Korean are you? Or how Eastern European, if we're talking about this, your second generation?
Yeah, I mean, you've asked two questions, Marie, because first you asked, Ed, how Pakistani do you feel?
Yes, let's do that.
So is it how Korean do I feel, or how Korean am I? How Korean do I feel?
Yeah.
Not at all. I don't feel at all Korean. And it's very confusing and very fertile non-feeling. I've been thinking about it for much of my adult life, this non-feeling. I think that, I'm still mulling over what you said about identity versus belonging and those roots, and the idea that, identity is a sameness with the self, and belonging is, an attachment to some, I guess I would assume, larger entity like,
Americanist.
America or, the Marines or something. I always, from early childhood, identified as somehow different, but I never felt a belonging to Koreans. Felt it a bit more so with Jews. My mother's a Jew, and I'm a Jew, and Judaism, in my experience, has a capaciousness that I have drawn great solace from. And so I've always felt that I'm Jewish without ever having felt that I had to kind of, prove it in some way. I think that one thing I'm thinking about also is that in this country, I think we tend to think of other places and other identities as being, very, being sort of these pure essences. There's this sort of pure essence of Korea and Koreanness sitting over there. And, maybe someone came over here carrying that with them, and, and then how much did they impart it to their child? And that's not true at all. And I think one of the reasons I don't feel Korean is it's an inherited condition. It's very much not because I don't identify with my father, but because I identify intensely with my father, whose own Koreanness was very problematic. Korea was a colony of Japan for a big chunk of the 20th century. And then, as most of you probably recall, it was divided by the superpowers and remains thus to this day. And my father's Korean life was conducted under colonial occupation. So my father was raised with a Japanese name. He had to speak the Japanese language to obtain education. His father had to publish complimentary articles to the Japanese regime in order to get ahead, and remains to this day sort of a pariah in Korea for having done so. And so the question of identity was already, back in like what you would call our old country, absolutely thorny.
Right.
So I've inherited this very problematic relationship to Korea, and my father's father had the same problematic relationship. It runs in the family. Yeah. So I think one thing I think about a lot is that our relationship to Korea is a relationship to this very complex and compromised idea of Koreanness that took place under colonialism, under imperialism, under any number of power intrusions, and it makes it kind of hard to say like, yeah, I feel Korean, but yeah. I do feel deep relationship to that set of historical problems.
Many layered in the sense that Korea itself is split identity in a way. I hear what you're saying, and it's super interesting and important. So what happens, because this is important in the conversation today, what happens when somebody tries to tell the story of your identity, of your immigrant past? What happens when, as happened in a book that was recently canceled because the author, who was actually a sensitivity reader, right, for one publisher, decided to write a book, decided to write a novel. The novel was not about being a white American as he is. The novel is about being two Muslim lovers, male lovers, in Kosovo. And there was a hue and cry from, I guess it was from Muslims who objected to this.
I think it was actually other sensitivity readers.
Other sensitivity readers, okay, not even Muslims perhaps, who objected to the fact that this in fact was an appropriation, a cultural appropriation, and nobody should be writing about, first of all, Kosovo, and second of all, Muslim lovers. male. So the publisher got nervous, but it was actually the author who himself had been a sensitivity reader in another publishing house to recall the book and cancel the book. So we are now in a state where people are very sensitive about, to the extent that you would have sensitivity readers, even in history books, even in political science books, even in, well, certainly in memoirs, and in fiction, to detect where the trigger points are that might offend somebody about the question of identity and belonging, if they themselves are of that ethnic or racial past. What do we do with that? What are your thoughts on the cultural appropriation, perhaps, of a Pakistani story by somebody who is not?
I mean, look, I'm president of Penn, so I got to answer it a certain way. So let me not be
very good president.
Let me not be the president of Penn.
Okay.
So let's forget that that's who I am. You know, there's a great Austrian writer, Robert Musil, which maybe some of you have read, and I remember him writing in his diary at one point something that one cannot despise one's own time without doing damage to oneself. So I do believe that that's true, and at least as an artist. And I have to ply my trade and make a living trying to find where the audience is, especially as a dramatist who has to be very sensitive to the audience. I mean, I have to sit in the audience and watch my work through previews and change it because the audience doesn't get a joke or they don't. So I'm very, very attuned to where the audience is, and I think that I understand that these are real questions for them. So it's not really a matter of whether it's a good question or it's a bad question, it's what the audience is worried about. It's part of the reason that I think I have pivoted into the fiction of being the author of books about me that are fictive, because it's a way for me to get around all of this stuff and to not be concerned with it and at the same time meet the audience where they want to be met. So if I'm writing, like in Homeland Elegies, there's lots of other characters and nobody questions whether or not I can write those characters because everyone thinks it's a memoir. So it's my way around it. As far as other people, look, people can do whatever they want, you know, they can write stuff. It doesn't mean I have to read it. You know, if they write about Pakistani people, you know, maybe I'll read it, maybe I won't. I probably won't. I'm busy, so I'm not worried. And that's a facile response, and that's a little bit more the Penn president, but it is also just me. I don't really care. I mean, my favorite writer, the writer I read every day, every single day I read Shakespeare, every day. I was reading him this morning. And he is the best. He's so good. He didn't know any of those people he was writing about. He'd never... Yeah, but if you're gonna... Okay, but he's really good. So it's like we're still reading it because he's so good. And a lot of this sort of characterizations, they're kind of, if you know the historical backgrounds, they're kind of ridiculous. They're ridiculous that he would, you know, represent Othello. I mean, Othello's written for a white guy in blackface. Othello's not written for a black actor. He didn't have the experience of any black actors. So, but it's really good. And so that's the thing that I just think about a lot. Shakespeare, really.
Yeah. What do you think, Susan?
I mean, I agree. And I do think that if it's good, that solves all the problems. Like, I do think that, you know, a lot of these controversies were too nice to say, actually, it's bad writing. I also think that access is an issue now, has been an issue, will continue to be an issue. I think that will continue to change and hopefully improve. These aren't new questions in my mind. at all these questions about appropriation, authenticity, who gets to tell what story. The flip side of it is we only need one, by which I mean, I remember when Chang-rae Lee published his debut novel, I was working on mine, and I thought very despairingly, oh no, now we have one, by which I meant a Korean-American writer. And I actually felt pretty bummed out because I didn't think I was going to have a career, because I was familiar with this American white-dominated publishing landscape in which you only need one. Now we've expanded this. Now, like, you only need 10, but there is still this sense of now we have a few, we can have a few more, but there's still, I think that's the flip side of this kind of policing, and this question of who gets to tell what stories. The truth is, do a good job. Be a great writer, which is to empathize with the human condition wherever you seek to write about it. I'm thinking back to the writer that I, often take shelter behind when I think like, oh, can I do this? Should I do this? I think of Philip Roth, and take a little courage because, when Roth first started publishing his magnificent stories, some of which I teach year after year to my students, they never, ever, ever. Okay, Shakespeare, he is. I'm not gonna do like Shakespeare versus Roth. I'm just not gonna do that. I think they're both pretty good. And when Roth first started publishing, many a person said like, no, it's bad for the Jews because there just weren't enough Jewish writers. And there was this feeling that like, oh no, there's always sort of this fear of like, what is the world defined as mainstream white people? What will they think of us if they read this? And I feel that in many ways that problem has been has kind of faded because this idea of the Jewish writer. Roth isn't a Jewish writer. He's an American writer. He's not an American writer even. He's a writer, one of the greatest we ever had. Right. And so the idea that he had to kind of like carry the good reputation of the Jews in, throughout mainstream, aka white non-Jewish America, that's an old idea. And I do think that a lot of our struggles now around appropriation and authenticity and who gets to tell what story are new versions of these same worries. Yes. And I think that these worries, I hope, get solved by more stories and good writing.
Right. If I could add to what Susan's saying, I think of, again, another great dramatist, not quite as great as Shakespeare, but Bertolt Brecht, and the absurdity of the good person of Sichuan. It's such a ridiculous portrayal of a Chinese woman. It's just like, it's absurd, but it's sublime. And so in a way, it's like, again, we get back to this idea of poetic truth versus sociological truth versus what? What exactly is the truth that people are looking for when they're saying, I want this to be authentic? Because presumably, if Shakespeare is the template, at least he is for me, it's not about that. It's not the sociological truth or authenticity of whatever he may or may not be writing, set in Bohemia or set in Venice or set in any number of far-flung places that he never visited. It's about what poetic truth he is able to extract from those characterizations. And even the much maligned process of so-called imagining the other, in imagining the other, he extracts such profundity and such universality that it doesn't matter. But again, we've become less sensitive to poetic truth. I think we don't have the same ken for it. And so that makes it complicated for a writer to be writing at this particular moment and to try to meet the audience where they are.
I agree. And of course, publishers complicate that. But you wonder what a sensitivity writer would do with Rudyard Kipling, right? Or with E.M. Forster. Or I'm thinking also of Kazuo Ishiguro, who writes a book called Remains of the Day about an English butler, right? Was he stepping on toes? If you look at it in reverse, it becomes kind of ridiculous and funny. But this is where we are in navel gazing, I guess, is what it is that publishing has come to. And yet, wonderful books like these get published. I want to ask you if you have questions of these authors, and please step up in. Yes, if you would stand up, please.
I think some of us aren't in the publishing industry and don't.
Oops, I'm sorry. Could you start again a little bit louder?
Could you explain a sensitivity reader? It's a new term to me, even if you're not in the publishing business. I was unaware that they have someone to make sure that they're not triggering thoughts we should have.
Yes.
Sure. I mean, look, let's cut to the chase here and sort of get this out of the way. This is all about liability. This is not about some kind of like cultural thing. We're all complicit. We all go to lawyers. We're all worried about being sued. Corporations are the same. We're now in a culture where this particular front of appropriation or whatnot can get a publisher into trouble. And so that's what this is about. And so internally, editors used to be sensitivity readers. Editors used to have a sense of like, oh, well, maybe you don't want to refer to this character as X because you're going to, but now there is the need for a supervening layer of opinion and protection that, in-house, those folks are called sensitivity readers. Some of them may be great at their jobs. I mean, it's not, we're not trying to malign it, but let's also not turn it into a cultural issue because at root, it's really about liability.
I would take a bit of issue with you because it is an issue in the public. I mean, you do have these social media.
Right, but I'm saying that the publisher is worried about it.
Publishers are worried about it, so they employ the sensitivity readers because of social media sort of mobs trying to criticize an author, or as happened with American Dirt, has happened actually with Muslim books on Muslims for, gosh, it goes all the way back to at least 2000. So it's been with us for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say a couple things about sensitivity readers, and I've actually never. My books have been read for liability issues, but not in the same way. Pro and con. I think there are ways in which, so sensitivity readers, as the name might suggest, are, an additional set of eyes on a manuscript, looking for ways in which the manuscript might be insensitive to underrepresented groups.
Right.
I would argue that this isn't inherently a horrible idea. I think that it is important for us to always be thinking about underrepresented groups. I also think that in an ideal world, sensitivity readers could be maybe sort of like what I was as a young person when I worked for the New Yorker magazine as a fact checker. And what I did was I checked the facts in articles, and my job was to invisibly make sure that the articles were as accurate as they could be. I was there to serve the vision of the writer by helping them confirm factual material that might be in danger of we might be in danger of getting things wrong here and there. So sensitivity reading could, in an ideal world, be a way to ensure that a work is the best version of itself that it could be. But that isn't the way they're used in publishing. The way that sensitivity reading is used in publishing is, as Ayad said, to protect the interests of the publishing house, to protect the publishing house from embarrassment, to protect it from bad press. It isn't really, I don't think, about increasing representation of the underrepresented. It isn't about bringing the voiceless in and giving them voice. It is about protecting reputation. One other thing I want to say quickly about it is I was in another panel as an audience member last weekend in which this very same topic was being discussed, because this is a big deal in publishing right now, and one of the authors discussing it, an African-American author, said, you know, one of the problems with sensitivity readers is that you have someone tasked with reading a manuscript to represent the interests of the entirety of the African-American population. And so you create a homogeneous monolith out of a whole bunch of people who are not the same. Mm-hmm. And it's on some level racist, I would argue. And this author spoke about being told by a sensitivity reader that one of her characters was not a good representation of an African-American character, because African-American people aren't like that. It didn't really matter that she, the author, was an African-American author. And she said of the character in question, well, this person's like this. That's my character. So I can get behind certain of the reasons that this is a thing that's being done, but it's not a thing that's actually addressing any of those problems in any meaningful way, and is actually creating additional problems.
Yeah. It's like Arthur Anderson, the accounting firm, getting, you know, sort of slammed for something or cornered for something, and then creating a risk management department.
Right.
Like that's fundamentally what we're talking about.
Thank you. Yes, here.
I'd just like to add to this debate. Look, I only write non-fiction, so the book of mine is currently going through the sensitivity process. But I also noticed from my latest contract for this book, and presumably successive books, there's a morality clause now, so that if I behave egregiously in some form that will bring the reputation of the publisher.
We know you won't do that, Simon. You won't do that.
Could you repeat that for everybody?
Yeah, Simon was saying that in his latest contract, there's a morality clause that I'm not sure to what extent it lays out the bad behavior you can't be engaged in, but it's fairly specific bad behavior. I'm sorry for you, Simon. I'm sorry.
Over here, please.
Yeah, I was just curious along the same lines as sensitivity readers, what your, first of all, thank you, all of you, for your work, and I've read all of your books and really enjoyed them. I was curious about trigger warnings, your thoughts on trigger warnings.
See what I mean about where the audience is? It's like to be an artist today is to have to deal with this.
No, it's a.
I was an English major.
Yeah.
I was an English and psychology major, and read I don't know how many books. I didn't count them, and never had a single trigger warning. And I also have spent a large part of my life as a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner. And so I hold both of those things. And I'm just very interested to hear, as authors, your thoughts on trigger warnings for students.
It is, well, should I?
Yeah, please.
I mean, trigger.
Could you repeat the question?
Repeat the question.
The question has to do with trigger warnings and our view of them. And for those who aren't familiar with this term, and I don't know if this is going to be a full explanation of trigger warnings, but the idea of the trigger warning is that if there is content in a work that could be triggering to a survivor of, say, sexual abuse, that readers get advance warning of that content. I've engaged with this a lot. There's a story that I have taught for my entire career. I taught it for a decade and a half without ever giving a trigger warning. And then I think it was about 6 years ago, I assigned the story as I'd been doing for years, and I was chastised by my students for not having given a trigger warning. It's been a learning process for me because I personally don't desire trigger warnings in my engagement with literature. However, I don't any longer think that as a teacher I can disregard the request for them. At the same time, there's competing interests here because some students also don't want trigger warnings. I now do optional trigger warnings. So I'll say to my students, if you want to receive trigger warnings, let me know. And then I will give you a sort of the thing on the outside of the pack of cigarettes that says, warning, this story contains, egregious depictions of violence and allusions to sexual abuse of a minor. And then for the students who don't request the warning, they just read it the old-fashioned way without actually knowing what's in there.
I mean, for me as a dramatist, it's problematic because it's the biggest tool that I have in my toolbox is surprise. Right. So, I have to, it's hard. And yeah, thankfully I don't teach, so I don't have to navigate that in that way. But the audience, when Amir, starts beating up Emily on stage, it was about 10 years ago, and I think if it had come out 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, I think the play might have had a very different destiny, because I think people might not have been able to receive it without a warning.
Well, it's interesting because I think we're about to close soon. So I just want to mention Jim Billington, who was the Librarian of Congress and my employer for a while, always used to say, education should be engaging in dangerous activity in a safe place, which is, what a book is, right? Engaging in a dangerous activity in a safe place. So I think that that's where I want to close this. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you guys so much, Marie, Susan, and Ayad. That was a wonderful, wonderful discussion. And I liked your mentioning truth in storytelling. It's sort of the theme of the WIT Festival in general, not just this year. But, this is our first year. We're coming back next September. And hopefully for many, many years to come. I want to thank all of our speakers, panelists, and introducers. You all have given us so much to think about and talk about, to imagine and reimagine. We've just heard about identity and belonging in America. Dan launched this year's festival with talking about the conflict between religion and science and what we can learn from that. Roxana and Geraldine discussed how through their fiction they can take on the tough issues, both our past and present, and reimagine them. And David and Skip yesterday talked about the narratives around our racist history and changing those narratives. Harry and Simon talked about at least what I viewed it as is our hobbled foreign policy, and the conflicts ahead of us, and the need to reimagine our foreign policy. Letty yesterday in our pop-up event talked about Shonda, shame, and really, when you were framing the conversation today about identity and belonging, in a way, that's what Letty, yours was about too. Today, we heard from Linda Nico about our politicized Supreme Court that represents really a very minority view, and it got us to think about how we might imagine creating law in the future despite that court. It's going to take a lot of imagination. We also learned from Betsy and Doug's conversation about just how bad the future looks climate-wise, and how to imagine ways to avoid the doom that we seem to be plunging straight towards. Can we change enough? Can we change in time? And every one of these topics actually has led me back to our broken political system. At least that was my takeaway from pretty much every single one of these conversations. And, just sort of the way that recent politicians, your muse for one, have just sort of changed the narrative in a way that doesn't represent truth. So I'd love to hear what your takeaways were. But before I let you go, I have a lot of people to thank, so please be patient. I also want to remind you about the community service play tomorrow at 11 here, which is going to be fantastic. I want to thank our sponsors, first of all, for enabling us to offer these talks for free. Really, really thank you so much. Joan Leonard Casulo, and if I screw up anybody's name, I'm really sorry. Hans and Kate Morris, Pamela Pescolito at the Book Loft, Hunter Runette and Mark Vandenbosch. Thank you, Harper's Magazine, Lapham's Quarterly, Oakland De Silva and Phillips, October Mountain Financial Advisors, Laura Peterson, Penguin Random House, Mary Ann and Bruno Quinson, Roxana and Tony Robinson, and Diana Rowan Rockefeller. And all of our wonderful partners, the Berkshire Eagle, Berkshire Magazine, thank you guys for getting the word out. Blue Q, Gateway Inn and Restaurant, Joe Wheaton Sculpture, Harvest Smokehouse, The Mount, Edith Wharton's Home, the Red Line Inn, the Stanover Farm, and Wine and Spirits Magazine for giving us wine, which we much appreciate for all our events and evening events. But I want to echo Hunter, if you don't mind, because most importantly, I want to acknowledge Lynn Bolger, as Hunter already did. I mean, this festival, she came to the Authors Guild Foundation about a year and a half ago, right? And in 1 year, she came up with the idea, and in 1 year, with her development assistant, Nikki Maniscalco, they created this from nothing. Really kind of extraordinary. And I also want to thank our very hardworking and efficient and fun board committee and our incredible chair, Will Thorndike, who is hands down the best meeting chair I've ever encountered. Learn a lot from him. And I want to just call out, because it's not in the program, the committee members, because they helped conceive of every aspect of this festival. Maria Arana, Roland De Silva, Richard Ford, Laura Peterson, Doug Preston, Roxana Robinson, Hunter Runette, who has done so much to help Lynn here on the ground, Wendy Strothman, and Will Thorndike. If you guys are here, and also other board members who came, Janet Bell, who did an introduction yesterday, Rachel Vale, who did today for Wild Symphony, for Dan, and all of our board members who are here. If you guys could just stand, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you, guys. And last but not least, I really want to thank all of you, especially you guys who hung out till the end of our panels. Thank you for coming and participating in the festival and joining the conversation. As I said, we'll be back next September. And all of these panels have been videoed, and they will be on our site within about a month, authorsguild.org. So I hope to see you guys all tomorrow at 11 a.m. here for the play. Good night.